Do you feel like you're just fundamentally lazy and therefore you can't get things done, can't be a productive member of society, but then at the same time you're also like a perfectionist and have to, if you're going to do something, you have to do it perfect, and so it makes it even harder to get things done? Turns out that if that's the case, it may not actually be that you're lazy. There may be a very different explanation for that. My name is Sean, and I'm a mental health coach. I see about 40 clients a week, and I have a 98% satisfaction score from over 1,200 ratings. Today, I'm going to lay out a narrative that may help to explain part of why you call yourself lazy and what's actually behind it. So imagine for a second that you are a kid and you are looking around at everybody else, and you know that you're a pretty smart kid because lots of people tell you so. But as you look around at all of the other kids, they seem to be able to do stuff that you feel like you can't do for whatever reason, even though you're just as smart as them. And then on top of that, adults are always coming up to you and telling you, "Oh, you're so smart, you're so talented. If you would only just apply yourself, you could fulfill your potential." If this narrative sounds familiar to you, it's possible that you may be neurodivergent. Now, keep in mind, I am not a medical professional, so I cannot diagnose neurodivergence, autism, ADHD, any of that stuff. I can't do that. So it may be worth going to a medical professional to get a diagnosis. Maybe. There are sort of two reasons that diagnosis is helpful. The first is that it can be extremely validating. If you have struggled with something your entire life, and then you find out that there is a scientific explanation for it, all of a sudden it's not like, oh, like it was just something in my head, it was just that I was lazy. Instead, it's like, no, a medical professional told me that yes, my brain works differently and therefore these things are harder. The second reason is for treatment. So if there is some sort of treatment for the thing that you are getting diagnosed for, it allows you to get access to that treatment. So a very simple example would be if I had cancer, it would give me access to chemotherapy and I would be able to get help for that. So if either of those things sound appealing to you, either being able to get treatment or getting the sort of validation from the diagnosis, then it may be a good idea to see a medical professional. However, if not, if you don't really feel like you want treatment and you don't think that you think that you can sort of validate yourself, then diagnosis may not be something that's necessary for you. Another thing to keep in mind is that the way that diagnosis sort of works is that there were a bunch of old white guys sitting around in a room, and they were like, all right, well, here are all the symptoms of this particular thing. How many symptoms should people need in order to get diagnosed? And another guy was like, I don't know, 6? And he was like, yeah, that sounds good. Let's do 6. And so then that's how you get diagnosed. So what can happen is that you could have 5 out of the 6 and you may not get diagnosed with whatever it is that you're getting checked out for. And so because this is the way that diagnosis works, I think that it is very useful, even if you do not have a diagnosis, either because you didn't seek one out or because they said, nope, you're, not XYZ. I think it is still useful to look at the things that the problems that people in a particular group face that you relate to, and looking at how those people solve those problems. So it doesn't mean that you have to, say that you are part of this group. It just means that you can learn from what this group has done. Now let's come back to this narrative that we were talking about earlier. This idea of a kid that is really smart, but can't get themselves to do things. What do you think that narrative teaches a kid? Usually it teaches them the lesson that they are either lazy or broken in some way. And so then oftentimes the way that people try to deal with this is that they will try to sort of brute force their way through life. They'll say, well, everyone else is doing this stuff that everyone says that I should do, and in a way that I should do it. And so I need to force myself to do it that way. And this is where the idea of masking comes in, where in trying to do it the way that everybody else is doing it, you actually sort of suppress your own identity, the way that feels natural for you to do things, and you try to do things like everybody else so that you can fit in and blend in. But the problem is that in order to do that, you have to work the way that everybody else does. You have to work 10 times harder. And so when you are working 10 times harder to get the same or worse results than everyone else is getting, it breeds this huge festering ball of shame inside of you. Let me illustrate this with an analogy. So let's say that you're a fish and somebody picks you up and puts you on land and says, "Now walk." How do you think that that fish would perform? It would perform terribly. It would not be able to walk at all, right? Because it's a fish. That's not what it's meant for. Of course it's going to fail at that task. You're the fish. Because that's essentially what people are doing. People are saying, no, 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 you need to perform this way. But that's not the way that your brain works. But if someone were to take that fish and put it in the water, boy, the amazing things that that fish could do. That fish could outshine so many other creatures in its ability to swim and breathe in water. But it doesn't get that chance because it is holding itself to this expectation to walk on land. And if someone would have just taken the time to give you the chance to swim in water, they might have seen how amazingly talented you are. Now, I know that as I say that, it's very possible that a whole bunch of resistance is going to come up. It's like, no, that's not me. I'm just lazy. But I really want you to think about, if you've related to any of this narrative, why you may be thinking those thoughts. Because, yeah, of course you would have resistance to this idea that you could be really, really talented and amazing in a certain aspect, because you have gone through your whole life having this idea reinforced that you suck at walking on land. And unfortunately, the trouble doesn't stop here, because once this narrative is established and keeps getting reinforced over and over and over again, and you feel like you're lazy or broken, then what happens is that life kind of sucks. You really don't want to, you don't want to go through life. And so instead you turn to something that can help make life a little bit more bearable. Something like substances, like marijuana or other drugs. And while you engage with those things for just a moment, you get to feel normal. You get to feel neurotypical. Oh, what an amazing gift. But I think that what is really sad about this is that it is a fundamental denial of your identity. It is saying, I am going to do something to try to make myself like someone that I am not. And then on top of that, there is the whole topic of, the side effects of using different substances, which is a whole other video. So now you feel like you're lazy, broken, you feel ashamed, and you're addicted to substances. This sucks. So what do we do about it? Fortunately, there is actually a whole lot that we can do about it. The first thing is to get in the water, to start to recognize that your brain does actually work in a really amazing way. It just has never had the opportunity to work in the way that it naturally likes to work. Well, sort of. So here's what I want you to think about. What are the things that are easy and effortless for you? What are the things that you really enjoy doing? And as you think about those things, I want you to think about what are the sort of core elements of these things. What do these things have in common? When I distill down, so for instance, a lot of people that are neurodivergent really like video games. What is it about video games that you really like? And as you start to distill these different elements and identify the commonalities between them, you'll start to notice patterns. And in those patterns, then you can take those ideas and you can start to plug them in to various areas of your life. Oftentimes, people who are neurodivergent like what I call shiny things. So things that are bright and colorful and exciting and interesting and puzzles to solve. They love that stuff. And so the question that I would ask you is, how can you make the day-to-day things in your life feel more shiny for you? And as you do this, you may start to discover that your neurodivergence can actually be a superpower rather than a curse. Now be careful, because as I talk about this, a whole bunch of resistance may rise up of like, no, this can't be a superpower. I'm just lazy and broken, and all of that shame starts to come up. And so that leads us into the second thing that you can do, which is starting to process the shame. So as you try to get into the metaphorical water, you may start to notice all sorts of thoughts come up like, well, but I shouldn't have to do it this way. I should be able to do it the way that everybody else does it. And that is actually the shame talking. And when the shame talks, it is really important that you don't try to fight it. A lot of people will then try to sort of suppress that shame, and it ends up just growing and festering and getting worse and worse. And so instead, what we want to do is we actually want to validate the shame. I know that sounds crazy, but let me explain. Validation is not the same as agreement. It has nothing to do with whether something is right or wrong. It just has to do with if it makes sense or not. It has to do with understanding. So when that shame starts to come up, in order to validate it, you can say something like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that I feel ashamed right now because my entire life I have been shamed for the way that I naturally work and told that I need to work in a different way. That's validation. And why is this important? Why does this matter? Why does this do anything? Well, just for a second, imagine that little kid who was really struggling and was looking around at everybody else who was, doing stuff and he couldn't do stuff. And imagine if someone had come up to him and said, hey, I know that you're really struggling. I think that there's actually a way that we could do this, that you could really shine. You could really do this in an amazing way. That is actually, different from the other kids, but it's just as cool. How much of a difference that would have made to just have someone sit down and help you through that. That is essentially what you are doing for yourself when you go through this process. And granted, sometimes it is very hard to do this process for yourself. And so if that is the case, I'd highly encourage you to talk to somebody about it. It's going to take time because remember that this process has built up, this shame has built up over a number of years. And so it's going to take time to process your way through it. The third thing that we can do is that we can use external hard drives. In neurodivergence, there's this idea that you can kind of keep a lot running in your head all at once. But once you let something out of your head, it's kind of gone. It's like it doesn't exist anymore. And so one thing that can be really helpful is that rather than trying to force yourself to save all that stuff on your own, having things that do that for you, things like notebooks, note apps, reminders, alarms, all of those things can help to offload some of that stuff that you're trying to hold for yourself and make it so that something else does it. So then you can just go and check on it. This is why a lot of people who are neurodivergent make lots and lots of lists because it helps them to stay organized. And finally, the last thing that you can do to help with neurodivergence, this is more of a sort of long-term play, but the last thing that you can do is meditate. And I know, there's a lot of like woo-woo around meditation, but this is actually pretty scientific in nature. Now, if you like the woo-woo around meditation, that's great. But just in case you don't, scientifically, there have been studies that for people who are neurodivergent, that frontal lobe function is impaired. And meditation helps to develop frontal lobe function from a scientific perspective. And the science says usually about 20 minutes 3 times a week will help to improve frontal lobe function. So for instance, one of the things that a lot of people with neurodivergence struggle with is executive function. Essentially being able to tell yourself to do something and then actually go do it. So, I need to go and record a video and then actually going and recording a video. That is really, really hard for a lot of people who are neurodivergent. And so by increasing frontal lobe function, it actually helps with things like that. And if you want to do a quick check-in on your mental health, there's a free 2-minute quiz that'll just give you some quick insights into areas that you might want to focus on. You can just go to ostaracoaching.com and check it out. I'll leave the link down in the description. The promise that I try to maintain is to make mental health resources that don't suck. And in order to do that, it's really useful to get feedback from y'all. So in the link in the description, there is a survey to take to let me know how useful this was for you and what impact it had on you. It's a real quick survey. I'd really appreciate it if you would take it. And then, if you want to, you can click the subscribe button and all that good stuff. Leave a comment, let me know, questions, anything like that. Now, in my experience working with people, the hardest part of this process is actually processing the shame. Once people are able to strip the shame away, things become a whole lot easier. But that process is really, really hard, and it requires some really good emotional processing tools. And so if you want to go a little bit more in depth with how to process your emotions, there's a whole video about processing your emotions that'll show up somewhere on the screen. I don't know where, but it'll show up somewhere on the screen. Click that video and check it out. Have a great day. Bye.